Okay, thank you for coming. I have been a teacher in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies here at Western for almost 6 years, and it has been a great privilege to be part of such a vibrant intellectual community. I would like to begin my talk today by extending my thanks to the members of that community, and especially to those on FIMS Student Council who not only organized this wonderful event, but saw fit for some reason to invite me to speak. In the interests of clarity, however, I should note that my presentation today stems from a larger project that I have been working on for some time, and which, in one way or another, is now drawing to a close. That project is about nuclear weaponry. More specifically, it's about a collection of love stories reproduced over the last 50 years that process the unthinkable nightmare which nuclear weapons allow for, open onto, and engender. Stories, above all, about love between people set against the backdrop of extinction. My goal then, in the context of this talk, is to discuss one of the elements in these stories, and since the theme of this conference lends itself towards meditations on emergency, I choose to discuss in as much depth as possible the terror we pretend not to see. Because I think there's something here that we need to see, some truth perhaps that we should all learn how to live with if we are to have any hope of living at all. One more thing too. I have been fortunate this term to run 3 classes concurrently, but I'm even luckier to have taught 2 of those in particular. Today, I dedicate my talk to the students in both classrooms, to my comrades in disaster capital, and my friends in race and technology. The web of meaning through which we discover our orientation and direction, our history, even our memories, that is to say, our worlds of practical involvement and concern, is founded on our relation to things and to others. It arises not just from the technical means that inframe our understanding, our thinking, and which determine in turn the material conditions of what is sometimes referred to as our way of living, but appears first and foremost through the relationships that we affirm, relationships that enliven the tools we use in order to affirm them, and which bring our worlds into sharp relief. In addition, the quality of our worlds depends to a great extent not just on the relationships we choose to develop, but under what conditions we are forced to maintain them. This includes both the devices we use to connect and communicate, as well as the instruments we may never see nor use, but respond to nonetheless, either because they facilitate the subsumption of all social life into an ever-expanding system of consumption and utility, or because their impact is so enormous, their reach so extensive, their dangers so threatening or incomprehensible, even obscene, that despite our personal inclinations, social position, or geographical locale, we find ourselves confronting the same enormity everywhere. And yet, despite that, or because of it, the scope of what confronts us is also still difficult to see. It is only when something breaks, when there is some catastrophe or disturbance in the coordinates that condition, that finally their meaning is clear. Without this rupture, wherein that which conditions now demands our attention, because suddenly, abruptly, our day-to-day life needs rethinking, that what we are requires repair, the constituent elements that structure my world and the relations between them that make it will continue falling backward into obscurity and forgetfulness, permitting indifference before pain in their place. In this time without pity, the only enduring hope is that we need never wait for the next disaster to know what's concealed in plain sight, since everyday life in the age of the superweapon, and by this I mean nuclear weapons, is reproduced in the context of a generalized atrocity. With that in mind, we might as well admit right here that we are out of our depth, never having learned nor realized until recently that as horrible as the political and military cataclysms of the 20th century were, the A-bomb's violently intense deflagration of psychic identity remains equally difficult to grasp, probably because it's still happening, or because we, as the lacerated victors, cannot believe this has happened, has never stopped happening to us, to you, a denial that I still share with you. For even as I strive not to cover over imagery that in 3 years of writing has never ceased to plague me, I find it hard sometimes to think as I should, to come up with a link, as Avital Ronell would have it, to the feeling tone of the unaccounted for, and to mourn in the way that I must. Like all those before me who have struggled to do this and failed, it would be hubris, even violence, to say that I know how, much less see or speak or know or pretend to understand the pain that some are still learning to bear or failing to, because learning how is just not possible. How can I when language fails me, when even now it fails me, as I try to respond to a memory of terror that stops all speech with the power of a koan? Responsibility demands that I admit my helplessness, and so I write in the open, unprotected. The Chrysalids by John Wyndham is a 1955 post-apocalyptic adventure story set in a world with no knowledge of the apocalypse. The characters know only that something happened, in that God descended and the earth was cleansed, and from this devastation, there grew a people ordained by the Lord as the keepers of his image. The story takes place in the future. The year is unknown, but modernity is over, and most of the earth is dead. What little life remains now clings to the fringes, and in places like Labrador, life is agrarian, theocratic, and genocidal. So blinded, in fact, are the residents of this place by the exaltation of their own being as idolizing the power they claim to protect, that no one, save a handful of children, comprehends the injustice done by those who deem themselves to be just. For to expose their hypocrisy or to publicly articulate one's disbelief in the principles that power it is a heresy made punishable by death. What interests me, however, is not the plot, but a few paragraphs toward the middle that haunt the action like a specter, wherein Wyndham, writing in the voice of an elderly sailor, describes a huge expanse of dead black beach positioned somewhere far away to the south. He calls this place the Black Coasts, citing a name that is not really a name, but the image of a world long stripped of all life. An image, therefore, of unbroken deserts whose infinite passivity and enduring facelessness are the very face of evil. The passage is worth quoting at length, so I'm going to do that now. You bear southeast a while and then south, and pick up the mainland coast to starboard. Further south still, you begin to find patches where only coarse plants grow, and poorly at that. And soon you come to stretches of coast and land behind it, 20, 30, 40 miles long maybe, where nothing grows, nothing at all. The whole seaboard is empty, black and harsh and empty. The land behind looks like a huge desert of charcoal. Where there are cliffs, they are sharp-edged, with nothing to soften them. There are no fish in the sea there, no weed either, not even slime. And when a ship has sailed there, the barnacles and fouling on her bottom drop off and leave her hull clean. You don't see any birds, nothing moves at all, except the waves breaking on the black beaches. It is a frightful place. Masters order their ships well out for fear of it, and very relieved the sailors are to keep clear. And yet it can't always have been like that, because there was one ship whose captain was foolhardy enough to sail close inshore. Her crew were able to make out great stone ruins. They were all agreed that they were far too regular to be natural, and they thought they might be the remains of one of the old people's cities. But nobody knows any more about them. Most of the men in that ship wasted away and died, and the rest were never the same afterwards. So no ship has risked keeping close in. Such study as has been possible at a distance cannot be detailed, but such as have been made indicate consistently that living forms are in the process, although in the most profane shapes, of encroaching upon this fearsome desolation, unquote. Wyndham is obviously writing about the future. More than this, he's writing about a temporal imaginary that Peter C. Van Wyck refers to as the deep future, transporting readers to a time so far beyond our own that the temporal gap between now and then might as well be infinite. In this distant age, civilization as we know it is finished. All that remains are the fragments of what was. But even those are impossible to uncover, since nearly every trace now endures in a space so black and barren, that to walk on the ground is to die there and then. To get to these ruins, one must be willing to travel south and do so by sea, embarking on a ship that by all rights belongs to the empires of the 16th century, not the scrubby colonies of the distant 61st. How far one must travel is never answered, of course, but the direction of the voyage, the nature of the disaster, and the severity with which the Black coasts have been afflicted by what is always classified as an unknown catastrophe are proof enough of location, because this is a land that is not only ruined, but poisoned in a manner both permanent and invisible. Moving inland across the continent, the view is the same. The desolation of the beaches and of the great stone ruins that litter them stretches across the surface of the earth. There is no respite, just barren stretches miles across where it looks as if all the ground has been fused into black glass like a frozen ocean of ink. Those foolish enough to sail inshore or to land upon the edge of what is surely the blasted remains of some coastal American city are destined to waste away and die in a manner that is more than just inexplicable, but as alien and as fearsome as the black lands that caused it. To die here, either in or as a result of the atomic desert, is to be killed by a threat that cannot be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched, where the appeal to the eyewitness, even to one's own eyes, comes to have little value, because there is nothing here, nothing to be seen. There is only an emptiness that devastates all contextual ground alongside the surface of the planet. Indeed, even those who survive their encounter with this environment leave it knowing that they will never understand how or why it came to be. The only certainty stems from the knowledge that what lies ahead surpasses the most frightful nightmare, as these same stretches of dead black land appear to extend so far beyond the horizon that they must go on like this to the ends of the earth. Wyndham. The Black Coasts would appear to be an extreme form of Badlands. Since any close approach to them is likely to be fatal, nothing can be said of them with certainty but that they are entirely barren, and in some regions are known to glow dimly on a dark night. The mystery of the coasts is total. They cannot be approached, and nothing can be said of them. They are, persisting in a manner that defies comprehension, and always at a distance from those who would strive to understand, to know why. Yet, even if the events that produced this environment were explicitly identifiable, either to the sailors who look upon it or to us as readers who know something of its origins, there would still be the issue of what Claude Lanzmann calls an unbreachable discrepancy, and thus no solution of continuity linking the world that was to this new one that now is. How could there be when such a thing cannot be explained, when explanation as such is simply not possible when confronting a nightmare like this? This is, after all, humanity's endgame, realized through the weapons of the Cold War, an event whose effects defy all description, all thought, all attempts to unpack it, even mine, because all that can be said is this: if there is any meaning to this landscape at all, it stems from a sense of the sublime, but a sublime whose effects accord primarily with what Jean-Francois Lyotard and his theory of the different, as the irradiated shores of Wyndham's post-catastrophe future purposely confront the reader with a vision of the unthinkable that prompts only silence, and which gestures toward events that are ultimately inassimilable as any prior understanding of lived experience or what it might mean to live in general is effectively uprooted, thrown down, and destroyed, just as whole cities were raised in these stories only to fall back in ashes. There can be, after all, no discourse but this silence, nothing that responds and nothing to respond to but the emptiness and the silence. For when we are faced with a vision of the future in which all things everywhere have long been destroyed, we encounter a world in which all things disappear, save for the one thing that can't. Thickness, coarseness, massivity, wretchedness, consistency, weight, all of which lie congealed in materials now free of all relations, because here only matter, absurd, humble, bare, and ugly, weighs heavily on the surface of the earth. When engaging the brute but impassive presence of material objects enduring, I can deal only with reminiscences, that is to say, with stories. What else can I do when the objects are textual? When, like the moment of my death, I cannot know the end of time except in stories? After all, the remainderless cataclysm promised for half a century by the weapons of the Cold War never happened, It remains, as Jacques Derrida insists, fabulously textual, a discursive event written about and spoken of, but whose very possibility, whose power as a mere hypothesis, nonetheless conditioned every discourse and all strategies for over 40 years. As Derrida suggested in 1984, no single instant, no atom of our life, of our relation to the world and to being, is not marked today, directly or indirectly, by this ongoing disaster that still goes unrealized. Since the very idea of total war in the nuclear age, as a structuring hypothesis, a fantasy or phantasm, is itself so powerful, even as mere speculation, it functions also as what he called the absolute referent, the horizon and condition of all others, being the only thing capable of devastating, again, what he calls survivance, or the affirmation of survival that exists at the very heart of life. If only because, as we already know, the world that awaits us after such a war is not necessarily a world, since not only could there be almost nothing left, but, more nightmarishly, no one with whom to clothe what is left in the language of meaningful forms. Indeed, even now, as I strive to think through this, I find my energy fading, because even my active speculation of attempted face-to-face confrontation garners no new knowledge, no new power, but annihilates instead what I used to know, or better still, whatever I thought I already knew. For just like Wyndham's sailors and other characters and other stories produced by other people, I too, in my attempt, also stand in the footprints of the last living man, enduring a shock that by all accounts cannot be mitigated, mourned, nor adequately anticipated, because to be here, in this place, at this time, is to experience only the recollection of the unrecallable in the face of the incomprehensible, and thus the expurgation of any meaningful self against the backdrop of permanent night. My point being that within this waste that covers the planet, there is, without there mattering what there is, without being able to fix a substantive to this term. For even beyond the distant line dividing the sea from the sky, there is only the hush which presides unopposed over the black lands of the earth. Wyndham again. No wonder none of us ever came this way before. It's like going over the rim of the world into the outskirts of hell. It must be utterly beyond hope, bar to any kind of life, forever and ever. But why? Needless to say, there is no why. Not when shipped from sites of nuclear devastation are images of illogicality and silence. And certainly not when the damages these images depict seems to lay waste to absolutely everything, even spreading out beyond the limits of the blast zone to contaminate our experience of being in time. For there are no faces here, no things, not nothingness nor beings, but only the end of all possible worlds and the utter devastation of worldhood in general, given that within these empty spaces that are in fact not empty spaces, but being packed with the fullness of some eternity, some tangible darkness with nothing to see, but some zone in which nothing is, there is only our gaze before what that is, or, at best, a formalized abstraction of what goes on in the absence of other people, in which the interstitial character of time's infinite unfolding, where there is no point one can hold to, is represented here by some unending night and the terror of meaningless time. To put it another way, what we face in the absence of all others cannot be classified as a world, since we do not encounter an apprehended exterior capable of engendering a world. Instead, in imagery like this, we confront something else, something which Christopher Bolus might call an instance of the unthought known. Because whether we are talking about the death of all life or just the palpable absence of other people, we are in each case provoked by the specter of a future whose core of significance, though in some way sensed, remains as yet undiscovered. Still, let's be clear that imagery like this should paralyze our thinking, that we should feel, should we allow ourselves to feel, not just malaise or dis-ease, but a powerful form of vertigo, even terror, when faced with images like these, is not due to the fact that the futures depicted are themselves so covered by darkness that we, bearing witness, fail to anticipate nor imagine whatever might be present in them or approaching. It is due to the fact that in this night we sense that nothing approaches, but a nothing that touches, that mortally wounds us, since we cannot mourn nor affirm our survival, not when faced with nothing we could possibly reaffirm, not when in mourning we must have by default or be able to readily identify the means to produce and reproduce another world in the fire and ruins of the present. Our panic, therefore, stems not from something which the desolation sometimes conceals, but from the powerful feeling that when totally alone we are horribly vulnerable and exposed, as if in the knowledge that nothing approaches, we are menaced by terrible evil. J. Robert Oppenheimer once said, "It did not take atomic weapons to make war terrible, nor did it take atomic weapons to make man want peace, but the atom bomb was the turn of the screw. It has made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up those last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond there is a different country." Sadly, the prospect of a future war has been nothing if not tolerable. American conflicts in Korea and Southeast Asia, where nuclear annihilation was always considered a plausible alternative, are a testament to this fact, as are the continued political posturing of new and newly emerging nuclear states, such as India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Iran. In many ways, the ability and the willingness to destroy humanity is the preferred political currency for those still eager to influence the course of international politics. The trick, it seems, is to survive the onslaught. On the other hand, no matter how inaccurate Oppenheimer's original speech ultimately proved politically, the validity of his statement persists, albeit differently, because although his mountain pass never led to an international body politic predicated on peace and mutual understanding in an effort to avoid World War III, the father of the bomb is absolutely correct when his speech is applied to distortions produced in the structure of day-to-day experience, distortions produced by an outburst of death that no barrier, be it ideological or aesthetic, has ever been able to contain. Because even if Oppenheimer's turn of the screw swiftly proved to be a literal dead end, his work, its effects, the consequences thereof, have instead led us all to a different set of steps, where beyond lie the perils of a far more precarious country. After all, what is the promise of the superweapon, if not the devastation of all life in general? A threat so powerful in times of war and total peace that its mere possibility is enough to warp not just the practices of everyday life, but also what it means to be alive, as all other man-made dangers can be measured, quantified, or are at least in principle amenable to concepts of scale, whereas those posed by the weapons of atomic catastrophe will never be. How could they, when the purpose of these technologies, and here I speak of all tools and spaces built in cathexis with the nuclear, is not just to murder another or annihilate others, nor even to protect one's own against those who would murder because you too are also other, but to lay waste to all life indiscriminately, and to do it from the safety of the grave in anticipation of a resurrection that will never come. Every ballistic missile, every missile silo, every subterranean fortress designed to protect the powerful and not the populace is more than a measure meant to threaten and defend against the nightmare of impending doom. Each is a link in a signifying chain that projects its shadow onto every place, inflecting lived experience with the sense that something, some life, some way of being has already ended, that whatever we are or thought we once were has, in effect, already died, or, worse still, is now tainted by death. And not only because these weapons have rendered humanity killable as a whole, but because everything we are and ever could be will never not always be saturated in the appalling desolation of the real. The truth is, even now, the bomb's most pressing hazard is not, as Paul Virilio reminds us, that it could go off tomorrow, that there could be 5, 50, or 500 million deaths, but that 7 decades of dangerous living have profoundly changed what living means, as the terrestrial threats posed by the bomb continue to overwhelm the imagination, while our unending exposure to the dangers presented consecrates the soil for our common ground. Since everyone, everywhere, now has no other choice than to live out their lives, not so much on borrowed time, but in the shadow of a zone that is in some way outside it. For the bomb changes not just the clouds in the open sky, nor the temperature of the air at the instant of detonation, but the social currents of every culture in which it resides. To accept these technologies and in doing so thereby assimilate the terror they both promise and represent, consciously or otherwise, is to become part of a death cult driven by a form of idolatry that places the superweapon at the center of life. To enlist a term proposed by Raymond Williams, nuclear technology, whether deployed as a weapon or as a means put to widespread use in the production of energy, alters nothing less than the structure of feeling, effecting a change in social experience that today is still in process. Indeed, to paraphrase one philosopher, Gunther Anders, from his own book, Burning Conscience, published 53 years ago in 1961, he said, "In the age of atomic weapons, there is a door in front of us that bears the inscription, 'Nothing will have been.' And from within, calling to us from beyond the door, there is a voice that whispers, 'Time was an episode.' To step through or cross over into the night that after Los Alamos will never not be waiting is to risk our disappearance from the planet forever, through which everything we are and think ourselves to be will become like an episode lost between two eternities, two nothingnesses. Namely, the nothingness of that which, remembered by no one, will be as though it had never been, and the nothingness of that which will never be. And because there will be no one left," he said, "to tell one nothingness from the other, they will melt into one single nothingness. This then," declares Anders, "is the completely new, the apocalyptic kind of temporality, our temporality, compared with which everything we had once called temporal has become a bagatelle, in that insofar as time is granted to us at all, we, as the lacerated victors, are sentenced to live in a situation whose character cannot change anymore. For in the time of the end, which can never end, save by the end itself, and which will remain the time of the end, even if we succeed in postponing the end of time from day to day, we are. This character of our epoch will never change, because once we have acquired the ability to precipitate the end of time, we have acquired it once and for all." I ask myself, what can be done with this knowledge? If there is some hope to be gleaned from the terror that we confront, and whether anything else can be said about this besides a few gloomy statements on how each generation is, at the moment, doomed to carry forward ever more powerful incarnations of this same technology, even if it means our annihilation. Suffice it to say, I'm still working on it, but what I do know is this. There is a powerful truth revealed at the instant that we are faced with this violence, and one which in time could potentially reground what it means to live in the present, forming the existential basis for some emerging counterpower, some love that could prepare the way for more radical political work, precisely because every person, regardless of geography, philosophy, history, class, gender, or race, would find themselves standing beside one another, occupying the same ground, since the bomb floods every place with the same implacable light. Thanks.